With the 80s now here, the Avalon Hill Game Company was in full swing. It continued to publish games at a breakneck pace, and the innovation and growth looked like it would never end. Over these years, Avalon Hill would arguably reach its peak, and we will take a look at that story here today on Legendary Tactics. "1981 was a year with some highs and lows. For example, Origins 81 took place on the West Coast, which was seen as a great thing, as gamers out that way wouldn't have to make the usual trek to places like Baltimore and Detroit. But it was far from organized, which led Don Greenwood to pen a couple of sharply worded articles addressing the issues in the general. However, the game development kept on rolling in 1981, which was a very productive time simply in terms of the number of titles released. Tom Shaw, in his role as Executive Vice President, at this point oversaw the entire operation of Avalon Hill, including acquisitions, development of new products, production, marketing, advertising, and promotion. He had years previously moved away from the design side of the company, but gave a very interesting interview in volume 17, number 5 of the General magazine, in which various issues of interest were addressed. The first was the persistent story that was even recounted in the company's official history published a year prior, that Avalon Hill had passed up the chance to buy and publish Dungeons & Dragons. Shaw disavowed the story, saying that contrary to popular belief, D&D was never offered to us. TSR sent us a copy, but only as part of our publisher's product exchange program. He continued saying, "In all honesty though, I wouldn't have accepted it even if we had been offered it. We just didn't have the staff or anyone in particular who could have handled the subject matter back then, certainly not to the extent TSR has done anyway." With regard to the sales disasters of their religious games, Journeys of St. Paul and Year of the Lord, he explained that intentions were good, as a priest from Pittsburgh had brought them to Avalon Hill as a project to fundraise, and Shaw thought they could increase the print run to allow distributions to religious academies around Baltimore. However, it failed spectacularly, and the unexpected reason for the failure of the experiment is interesting given today's societal climate. Shaw recalled that, "We thought they were both fun and educational. What we didn't know until it was too late was that most religions took themselves very seriously. The mere thought of using chance elements in games, particularly dice, was strictly taboo." He was also asked about his classic football strategy design, specifically the matrix that was so central to the games and the games it influenced. He claimed that it only took about 20 minutes to design, but it went through a rigorous playtest period, and is still undergoing minor changes from year to year, even though it has been on the market since 1959. Incidentally, the original version was published in a metal tube and sold for $2.95. Finally, Shaw addressed one of the elephants in the room, so to speak, and that was the failure of Kriegspiel, which had been designed in a day. Actually, I think it rivals football strategy's mark of 20 minutes. After all, it has less cards and a much simpler matrix. In all seriousness, it was designed as a last-minute replacement for a design that was promised and not delivered. We had to have a new product for the upcoming American Toy Fair, and it was an 11th hour thing or nothing. Shaw further explained that what most people don't realize is that Kriegspiel was a tongue-in-cheek game. It just didn't come off that way. One could sum up the public's reaction to it by saying that when it was published, the state of the art had already passed it by. So what of the games that were published in 1981? Amoeba Wars is a game with a bit of an odd premise. Players are the remnants of a fallen civilization among the stars, returning home only to find that their home sector has been completely infested by space amoeba. To win, one must retake Siestor, everyone's old homeworld, which sits at the center of the board. To do so requires directing spaceships to push back the amoeba, deal with the odd doomsday machine, and capture solar systems. The reviews of the game were mixed. Eric Goldberg in Area Magazine thought that, as an investment, Amoeba Wars is a good risk, while David Ladyman said in the Space Gamer magazine that he detected undercurrents of risk and cosmic encounter, but overall he found the game uninteresting. It also tends to be a game that runs a bit long, and there were some critiques of the component quality. Black Spy is really a film noir version of Hearts, except with 5 suits. It's a trick-taking game which starts when a player leads a card, and other players must follow suit or rank. If they can't, they can play any card they like from their hand. Black cards that are captured in a trick give points from 1 to 5, except the black spy cards, which give 10. Like hearts, after a player hits a certain point total, the player with the lowest score wins. It is apparently a nice twist on the old classic card game, but the spy theme is pasted on and doesn't offer any interesting aspects to the gameplay. Bureaucracy is a humorous roll-and-move game where 2 to 8 players begin at the bottom of the bureaucracy and must work their way to the top to become the director. Depending on the role chosen, one of Lifer, Overachiever, Empire Builder, or Hustler, a given player will have different advantages and disadvantages. Promotions, demotions, scandals, power plays, grievances, and bankruptcies are all here. The game comes with 2 rulebooks, one of which is a straightforward rules explanation and the other written in civil servant jargon. Apparently the rulebooks differ to a significant degree, though the game states that they are essentially the same. It has been speculated that this was done intentionally by the designer as a meta joke, to cause the type of discussions and arguments over minutiae that one finds in a typical bureaucracy. Down with the King is a political fantasy game with no supernatural elements, set in a world reminiscent of the political world of 17th century Europe. Each player is a noble who plots to overthrow the king. In order to succeed at this, players work to build their influence and prestige, and utilize interrogations, natural disasters, plagues, and other such things against their enemies. Players must at times work together, but, of course, ultimately only one can take the throne. There's no game board, so this game is essentially a card game with some role-playing elements, though quite a complicated one. Players can take any 2 of a possible 19 actions per turn, some of which can be taken during the turn of other players, so there is a lot to keep track of. The good news is that there is no player elimination. Instead, a player who is killed simply misses a turn and returns as an heir who appears quite hungry for revenge. Though the game can be longish, it has been called by at least one reviewer as a nice change of pace. Dauntless came from Battleline and uses the same system as Air Force, only this time it is set in the Pacific Theater. Famous airplanes like the P-38, the Zero, the Corsair, and the B-29 make their appearances. Battleline originally published Dauntless as a standalone game, but Avalon Hill instead published it as an expansion for Air Force. Dauntless added rules for things like ships and anti-ship weapons, dive bombing, torpedo bombing, depth charges, flak, kamikazes, radar, carrier operations, and rockets across a range of different pre-designed scenarios or ones of the player's own design. The game components include 30 different aircraft on data cards, 365 counters, and a rulebook which includes basic, optional rules, and a comprehensive historical summary. Reviewers David Bieksa and Carl Wiegers in Moves magazine agreed that the diversity of scenarios, both solitaire and competition, and the virtually limitless possible combination of fighters and dogfights ensures that Dauntless will provide many hours of enjoyment, as well as a deeper understanding of tactics in the air in World War II. The level of detail was lauded as well, but perhaps rightly criticized that it would likely be better handled in a computer game. A proposed Air Force Dauntless expansion kit named Sturmovik, which would have included planes from the Russian Air Force, was promoted around this time but unfortunately never published. Freedom in the Galaxy was a game that looked to capitalize on the popularity of Star Wars. It was originally published by SPI with the star systems on the board printed in pink for some reason. With the subtitle The Star Rebellions 5764 AD, it is a medium complexity game of high strategy and tactics with the map board spanning 30 solar systems. The plucky rebel player has to start insurrections on planets, hoping to cause a domino effect to create an effective rebellion. This is done mainly through sending their individual hero characters on missions to sabotage, start a coup, or conduct diplomacy, among other things. The Empire must use their superior military strength to garrison planets, crushing any rebellions that arise and keep the galaxy loyal. There was a lot of work invested in giving this game a backstory, with good and evil characters that give it a lot of flavor, and the game proved to be quite popular despite its reasonably high rules overhead. The reviews of this game were solid. Eric Goldberg said in the first issue of Ares magazine that the amount of care that went into the game and the smooth flow of play make Freedom a very good game, and rated it 7 out of 9. Tony Watson of Dragon magazine further commented that Freedom in the Galaxy is an impressive game. The scope is there, the action is present, and most importantly, the game has the color and flavor of the situation it portrays. Interestingly, some of the character names are actually anagrams made from the names of real SPI employees. In 1982, TSR unexpectedly acquired SPI, and as part of that process, Freedom in the Galaxy was repackaged as a TSR game. There were no updates as part of this, and even 2 major typos were ported over unchanged to the TSR edition. Much later, Microprose announced a digital version of Freedom in the Galaxy, but it was officially cancelled in 1999. Before Avalon Hill decided to publish it separately, the game Gladiator was one part of a 2-for-1 battle line game named Circus Maximus, which included the chariot racing game, which went on to become an Avalon Hill classic. But Gladiator had needed more work, so the game had been released separately and later to allow for some development time. Gladiator is about the man-to-man combat to the death that happened in ancient Rome. Each player takes a trained and fully custom-equipped gladiator against their opponent. These are given traits like movement speed, strength, agility, and constitution. And then each player battles using one of 11 maneuvers and up to 8 special maneuvers, focusing attack and defense points on different areas of the body until all opponents stop moving. There is a lot of dice rolling, but the matches are fast and furious, lasting only about 15 minutes each. Gold with an exclamation mark is yet another roll and move game where players compete to become the wealthiest. Each player gets a decent head start with $1 million and various certificates denoting assets in different currencies, which can be bought, sold, and traded. As players move around the board, they will land on spaces that cause prices or yields to change, to draw risk or option cards, or roll on the fate table, and try to reach the gold space first to end the game. The advanced rules add fluctuating certificate values and bank auctions of those certificates. The photo on the game's cover is of an actual pile of £1 million sterling worth of gold bullion. The Guns of August is an ambitious game that attempts to recreate the entirety of the First World War, and was Avalon Hill's definitive treatment of the conflict. One player takes the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria, and the Allied player takes the rest of Europe, including the United States, over 10 scenarios, using 4 map boards and over 1,000 counters. Players control infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineer units in monthly game turns. The scenarios range from playing the war 1 year at a time to a gigantic campaign game that covers the entire war from 1914 to 1918. The game is admired for what it tried to do, and it succeeds in some ways. However, a high counter density made for stacks of counters piled into small hexes, and the game could be quite ponderous over its lengthy playtime. In that sense, it successfully recreates the drudgery of the stalemate that was World War I. The game known as Moonstar, which was named by none other than Alan R. Moon, was originally published as Corona in 1974. Avalon Hill's edition added planets and other variants to the game. It is known as the first German game to come to North America, and any number of players can play. On the board, the 12 constellations of the zodiac are represented, and the playing pieces are moons and stars. First, there is an auction, and the highest bidder plays the round by rolling the dice and placing them on the moons, moving them the amount shown on the die. The player makes their bid by scoring where the moons end up, and scoring nothing if they miss. Of course, there are 12 scenarios that add or change different game elements, like challenging bids, making side bets, adding more moons or dice, changing planet values, or removing the planets entirely. Another game, Haroun, from 1984, was not a new game, but instead a re-themed copy of Moonstar. Another variation of the game also came out in 1993 when it was called Orbit, and a similar game which reused a lot of the same game elements was released in 1999 as Resende Roboter, or Ricochet Robots. The Peter Principle is a game that was published after the success of a book by Dr. Lawrence J. Peter of the same name, famous for the quote, "In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his or her level of incompetence." In a perverse take on corporate America, players, as employees of a huge corporation, must try to avoid promotion and remain competent by making the right decisions. At the same time, one has to force others to get promoted or into deadwood status, where a player accumulates too many wrong decisions that are found out. Similar in spirit to Avalon Hill's game Bureaucracy, this game was originally published by a company called Scoremore, which was known for publishing clear plastic games like 3D Chess and 3D Tic-Tac-Toe before disappearing in the early 80s. Storm Over Arnhem, a design by Courtney Allen, is the first of the so-called Area Impulse games created by Avalon Hill, which later spawned such great titles as Thunder at Casino, Turning Point Stalingrad, and Breakout Normandy. The Impulse games divided each full turn into mini-turns, where a small number of units may be moved or may fire. Once they've been activated, however, they are unavailable until the next turn. It was an innovative system for the time and is reasonably simple to learn and play. It picked up the Charles S. Roberts Award for Best 20th Century Board Game of 1982. Known as Struggle for Arnhem Bridge during development, the game recreates the fierce battle for the bridge in the town of Arnhem from September 18th to the 21st, 1944, part of what is known as Operation Market Garden. Essentially, the British start the game holding the bridge and must fend off the German forces for as long as they can. The game included extra counters that were utilized for a variant that was published in Volume 19, Number 1 of the General, called The Crossing. This variant allows players to recreate the famous crossing of the Arnhem Bridge by the German 9th SS Panzer Division, which historically led to heavy losses. Flat Top, mentioned earlier in the series, was a battle line game first published in 1977 and appeared in the company history as an Avalon Hill game in 1979. It received a third edition in 1981. There were also apparently a pair of releases called the Game of Slang and the Game of Trivia, but details of these games have been lost to the mists of time. The April of 1982 brought along something new and yet familiar. Avalon Hill's longtime rival SPI had just gone out of business, having been bought by TSR. Avalon Hill jumped at the chance to lure away some of the key staff members and created a subsidiary company to house them, which was called Victory Games. Under this new banner, the design staff, comprised of such legendary greats of the hobby such as Mark Herman, John H. Butterfield, Eric Lee Smith, and Gary Klug, continued to design games in the tradition of SPI, but without the frantic production schedule. It was a company that was to earn acclaim in its own right, but that is a story for another time. There was also a significant change at the General magazine, as Rex Martin took over as editor of the General with Volume 18, Number 5. Don Greenwood, who had been helming the magazine since coming on board with Avalon Hill 10 years previously, had taken on many duties at the company and had been stretched quite thin, so issues of the General had been repeatedly published behind schedule. Martin was called in as a replacement, and Greenwood moved on to full-time game design and development. Martin looked to improve the magazine, like streamlining the Reader's Buyer's Guide, which rated all the company's war games according to different categories. And the games kept on coming. Dragon Hunt is for 2 to 6 players, where each plays a king of Erewhon, who is vying to be the first to find and slay Brimstone the Dragon, who has been known to devastate the kingdoms from time to time. This can ultimately be achieved with the Mage Sword, which, if possessed, will earn one all the respect and prestige one might need and expect. Along the way, players raise army and seize territory as kings are wont to do. In Imagine magazine, Robert Holston was not impressed, saying that, unfortunately, given many of the inconsistencies, play mechanisms, and concepts, there is just too much fantasy in the worst sense of the word. Charles Vasey from White Dwarf was also harsh, saying it was Tolkien without the grandeur, Moorcock without the originality, and concluding that Dragon Hunt is not one of my favorite games. It does not really impress. The 7 Years' War is given an operational level treatment by Frank Davis and Edward Curran in Frederick the Great. One player takes Frederick the Great's Prussia, and the other takes the anti-Prussian coalition consisting of France, Austria, Russia, and some other European countries over 7 scenarios, 1 per year. Historically, Prussia and their British Hanoverian ally had much success against numerically superior armies, and this is what the game looks to recreate. The map board is of Central Europe, and while important leaders are represented, especially in that units cannot move without them, the armies utilize generic strength points. SPI had originally designed the game in 1975, first as a pull-out game from their magazine Strategy and Tactics, and then as a Ziploc bag game, but sold it to Avalon Hill at the time in an effort to relieve some financial problems. Avalon Hill released their version as a second edition with more counters, a mounted map, and new cover art by Roger McGowan. The components were critiqued as mixed. In Moves magazine, Roy Shelper said that the counters were bright and easy to read, but the board, alas, is very drab. Shelper liked the game overall, however. Graham Buckle, in the book The Best of Board Gaming, had called this a game where supply and maneuver are more important than battle. Buckle, however, didn't like the luck involved with the game, saying that it was not only unfortunate that decisive battles can turn on one die roll, but also that some of the scenarios were unbalanced, especially the 1756 campaign. Fredericksburg is a game mentioned in the company history, but there is shockingly little information left about it. One might assume that it is a reworking or straight republication of SPI's Fredericksburg, the Union repulsed December 13, 1862, which was published in 1975 as part of SPI's 4-game pack, called a quadra-game, named Blue and Gray 2. But this could not be confirmed. Why would you do that? The Game of Dilemmas looks to cause players to ask that question. A book with 150 situations forms the heart of the game. Players craft solutions to these situations and score points based on the solutions provided. But arguably, this is a game meant to generate discussions more than having winners and losers. A glance at Jim Dunnigan's Panzer Army Afrika, Rommel in the Desert, April 1941 to November 1942, will cause a surprised reaction with most gamers. Movement factors of 40, 50, even 60? How would that even work? Like its predecessor, Afrika Korps, it creates the entire fascinating North African campaign that took place between the Axis and British-led Commonwealth forces. Logistics is key, as it was in real life. The goal is simple. The Axis want to take the city of Alexandria to control the Suez Canal, and the Allies need to stop them. There are some variations in the order of battle as well, so alternate history can be explored. Despite inevitable comparisons to Afrika Korps, it arguably became a classic in its own right. Panzer Army Afrika was originally published by SPI in Strategy and Tactics magazine number 40 in September and October 1973, and was intended to be a very different take on the historical campaign, adding some twists to an otherwise normal hex encounter game. One of these was the high movement factors, which allowed for sweeping maneuvers and adding some suspense and surprises over its 8 to 10 hour playtime, where the game isn't over until the last skirmish. Avalon Hill acquired Panzer Army Afrika when TSR acquired SPI and sold off some of their games. Avalon Hill gave the game a bookcase box treatment and revised the rules and components. One challenge with this game had been that even the R&D staff at SPI conceded that if both players play aggressively, the Allied player is favored to win. However, if the German player simply takes Tobruk and defends it, the Axis would be virtually guaranteed a marginal victory. The Avalon Hill rule changes apparently addressed this and made a good game even better. In his book, The Comprehensive Guide to Board Gaming from 1977, Nicholas Palmer thought it to be an enduringly popular operational level game, where the controversial command control system is realistic and extremely irritating for the player affected. Pro Golf is a statistical simulation of PGA golf. Each player takes a player card that represents the performance of a real PGA golfer from that era, and then players get a chance to play a famous course, like Pebble Beach. The club is chosen, dice are rolled, the course booklet is consulted, and the ball's location is determined, and this is repeated until all 18 holes of the course are completed. It's a passable simulation of golf, but there isn't much player agency or narrative. At least the aesthetics are reportedly quite good. In Slapshot, players take on the role of a hockey team manager, trying to get your team into the playoffs. Skill in trading and drafting, wheeling and dealing, managing injuries, and your luck in general will get you the championship. That said, it really is more like an amped-up game of war, albeit one that is reportedly quite fun to play. Once again, Tom Dalgleish turns up here as one of the designers, as this was originally published under the title Team in Canada by Gamma 2 Games. GI Anvil of Victory was one of the big releases that year, yet another expansion for Squad Leader, adding more detail to the American forces and equipment. This gamette was originally planned to be released in 1981, but fans had to wait until 1983 to actually receive it. Even then, representation for the Italian forces were promised but not delivered. The game system wouldn't actually get Italian forces until 1989 in an advanced squad leader module. And what the eager fans got was bigger than the original squad leader itself, 5 new map boards, over 1,500 counters, and more scenarios than the base game. Overall, however, GI Anvil of Victory is a mess. The game had evolved to the point where the original counters from earlier versions weren't usable anymore, the artwork on the counters was not compelling, and there were plenty of drastic rules changes that made it very hard to figure out and play. This mass confusion would be the catalyst to creating Advanced Squad Leader a couple of years later. The Struggle of Nations is an ambitious historical operational simulation of the War of German Liberation, Napoleon's spring and autumn campaigns in Saxony in 1813. Kevin Zucker expanded his campaign system with this game, which was heralded as an excellent, if ponderous and complex, simulation of Napoleonic warfare on a grand scale. It is notable that attrition was a determining factor for each player's armies, and that there are 2 hex counters which could allow switching back and forth between marching and forming a battle formation. Titan is a classic game known quite accurately as a fantasy monster slugathon. Each side has a legion of mythical creatures like unicorns, gargoyles, and griffins, who roam the masterboard and try to recruit bigger and badder monsters to destroy their opponents. Combat takes place on a battle board that corresponds to the area where the battle is joined. This game uses buckets of dice to win said combat, earning points that can be used to enhance one's Titan, who can become very powerful in the process. The last Titan standing is the winner, which among experienced players could take 2 to 3 hours, but among timid or inexperienced players could take 12 hours or more. In Dragon Magazine, Bill Fawcett found Titan to be a very sophisticated fantasy game with original ideas, clearly written rules, and a very playable game system, though play occasionally gets bogged down, especially for newer players who are more apt to play conservatively. Charles Vasey said in White Dwarf that the game is not only tightly designed, it is pretty vicious. If you go into a fight, then only one side can survive. And in Imagine, Paul Coburn wrote that Titan has a very good feel to it indeed. It is the best board game I have come across for a while. Titan still has a very devoted following to this day. It was originally published by Gorgonstar in 1980 with Subpar Components, who licensed the rights to both Avalon Hill and later to Valley Games. Titan remained in the game lineup until the end of Avalon Hill in 1998, and Valley Games put out their edition in 2008, which even evolved into a game on the iPad in 2011. Wizards is a long but interesting game of fantasy adventure, as it takes place in a fantastical world where players race to get gem fragments for the High Druid. The layout varies for each game, as it is made of modular hexes that are arranged differently each time on a blank map board. Players choose to be one of a wizard, druid, or sorcerer, and must work together against the evil spirit. Most of the game is spent with players performing different mini-quests, moving around the islands to grab the quest-specific markers. But the pressure is on, as 10 quests need to be done per fortnight, and failure to do so causes one of the 18 islands to be attacked and flipped over by the evil spirit, removing it from gameplay. If the sacred circle is flipped over, the game ends and everyone loses. While the game is mainly cooperative, the endgame simply consists of players racing against each other to be the first to collect and deliver 6 gem fragments to the High Druid. In White Dwarf magazine, Jim Bambra recognized the well-written rulebook and the beautiful artwork in pastel shades, but felt certain unusual rules hampered the gameplay. The rules are not easy to understand because there are so many special cases which overrule the norms. For him, it rated a 7 out of 10, saying that in terms of enjoyment, Wizards is a success. Though it is at times frustrating, at other times it is compelling and fascinating. The Legend of Robin Hood was another import from OSG, where it had been published as a game in a Ziploc bag, but Avalon Hill reworked the components and put the game out in a small box. In this microgame, one player takes the Sheriff of Nottingham and his evil forces, and the other takes Robin Hood and his band of merry men, trying to steal from the rich, Merry Maid Marian, and get his pardon from King Richard. It certainly has a strong narrative aspect, as all the elements are there, from archery contests to stealing from the rich to give to the poor, to the triumphant return of King Richard the Lionheart. While it has the unexpected feel of a war game, the reviews were okay on this one, essentially saying the game was fun, fast, and not bad. Of note, it has a rule, number 13.1, prohibiting bigamy, which had to be a first in a board game. Civilization is a now classic game of epic scope for 2 to 7 players, which covers the development of ancient civilizations from about 8000 BC, when agriculture was first discovered, to the beginning of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century BC. Each player takes the leadership role for a Mediterranean or Near East nation like the Egyptians or the Babylonians, helping to develop their civilization not only by battling and controlling territory, but also by growing their economic strength, political influence, and cultural relevance. Every role from nomad to farmer, warrior to artisan, merchant to citizen has a role to play in one's cultural growth, and a balance must be struck between them. Civilization continues to have a large following, as it is seen as being one of the best games about ancient civilizations, and it is thought to be the first game to integrate a technology tree, where certain abilities are locked and unavailable until another ability is developed, which has been used in countless other contexts since. The one downside that is often mentioned is the playtime, which can go as long as 8 to 10 hours, sometimes more. But for those willing to get it to the table, it is an elegant design that deserves all the accolades it receives. Francis Tresham designed the game and published it in the UK through Heartland Trefoil. Avalon Hill acquired the rights to publish the game in the US in 1981, and Civilization quickly became a bestseller. In Dragon magazine, Tony Watson found the game to be groundbreaking, saying that once in a while a new game comes out that proves that there is still plenty of virgin territory out there for game designers to explore, and plenty of room for innovative and imaginative approaches to those subjects. He further gushed that Civilization is a game that defies comparison with others. It's a fine value and is highly recommended. Later on, in a 1990 edition of Games International, Steve Jones felt that Civilization is an excellent multiplayer game for those who like long games which require considerable thought, concentration, and decision-making. It was also chosen for the 2007 book Hobby Games, The 100 Best. Gibson's Games put out a new edition of the game in 2018. Additionally, in 1984, a computer game emulating Civilization was released by Avalon Hill. It was not called Civilization or Computer Civilization, but instead Incunabula, for unknown reasons. It had only one map and no trading, but was otherwise similar. It was seen as a decent game by critics, with perhaps limited replayability. One reviewer, Jerry Purnell, complained in Fire and Sword magazine that it had snaffled off more of my time than I could afford, a complaint players of the later Sid Meier's Civilization would certainly come to empathize with. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, Civilization was to play a significant role in the company's future and eventual fate, as we shall see. Avalon Hill would only have a few more years of peak production before everything changed. Join us next time as we approach the summit of the Avalon Hill Game Company here on Legendary Tactics.